Let's talk about one of those stories about a single person and a single invention that, and this is no exaggeration, completely remade the world as we know it. I'm talking about Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press.
You know, before Gutenberg, knowledge was, well, it was locked away. It was a luxury, whispered from one scholar to another or copied by hand, letter by painstaking letter. But after him, it just exploded. It became this force of nature, an avalanche of ideas that could suddenly travel faster and farther than anyone ever dreamed possible. It really was our intellectual Big Bang.
And it is so hard to wrap your head around just how massive this change was. I mean, just try to imagine a world where a single book could take a professional scribe years to copy. Every single one was rare, full of human errors, and so incredibly expensive that only the absolute wealthiest could even hope to own one. Then, boom, suddenly you have mass production. Books are consistent, they're affordable, they're accessible. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a complete reinvention of how information itself worked.
But to really understand the invention, you have to understand the inventor. So who exactly was this man who kicked off a revolution?
Well, Johannes Gutenberg was born around the year 1400 in Mainz, Germany. His dad was a merchant, part of the city's upper crust. But here's the crucial detail. He was also a skilled goldsmith. And that meant young Johannes grew up with this deep, hands-on knowledge of working with metal. Now, some political drama forced his family into exile, and he ended up spending about a decade in Strasbourg. And it was there that the very first seeds of his incredible idea started to grow.
Gutenberg was ambitious, for sure, but his early attempts at business, well, they were kind of a disaster. In 1439, he got this idea to make polished metal mirrors for religious pilgrims. The idea was they could capture holy light from sacred relics, but then a flood delayed the pilgrimage, the whole business collapsed, and Gutenberg was left totally buried in debt. It was a painful, painful lesson, but it taught him that his next big idea needed to be truly secret and a total game changer.
But that failure actually set the stage for his real masterpiece. This is where his background in metalworking and his relentless, almost stubborn ambition all came together to forge something the world had never seen before.
So what was the big idea? At its core, it was movable type. See, before him, if you wanted to print something, you had to carve an entire page out of a single block of wood. What Gutenberg did was create individual, reusable letters cast from metal. You could arrange them to say whatever you wanted, print thousands of copies, and then just break them apart and set up the next page. It was efficient, it was flexible, and it was scalable.
His genius really rested on three brilliant innovations that all worked together. First was the type itself. He figured out the perfect metal alloy, a mix of lead, tin, and antimony. Second, and this was his real secret weapon, was the hand mold. It was this ingenious device that let him mass-produce perfectly identical letters with incredible speed and precision. And third, he took a common screw press, the kind they use for making wine, and adapted it to apply the firm, even pressure you need for a crystal-clear print.
But the mechanics were only half the puzzle. The normal water-based inks that scribes used would just bead up and run right off the metal type. It was useless. So Gutenberg also had to become a chemist. He had to invent a totally new kind of ink, a thick, viscous, oil-based ink that would cling to the metal and transfer perfectly to paper. It was a complete, beautifully integrated system.
Okay, so the technology is perfected. Gutenberg is right on the edge of triumph. But this is where his personal story takes a really tragic turn. It's a story of a high-stakes deal and a bitter, bitter betrayal.
To fund this incredibly ambitious project, Gutenberg needed cash, a lot of it. So he partnered with a wealthy financier named Johann Fust. Around 1450, Fust loaned him 800 guilders, a fortune at the time. A couple of years later, he doubled down, investing another 800 guilders for what they called the work of the books. By 1455, the project was finally done, but right at that moment of success, Fust sued him.
And what was this work of the books? It was the legendary Gutenberg Bible. They printed about 180 copies. And this wasn't just any book. It was a statement piece. With its 42 lines of incredibly elegant, precise text on every page, it was designed to be every bit as beautiful as the finest manuscript ever penned by a scribe. It was the ultimate proof that his invention worked.
But Fust wasn't a patron. He was an investor. He wanted his money back, and with interest. So he took Gutenberg to court, demanding a staggering 2,026 guilders. Fust basically argued that Gutenberg had misused the funds, and he wanted control of the whole operation.
and the court sided with Fulst. Gutenberg was financially wiped out. He lost everything: his press, his specially made type, the whole workshop. In a final twist of the knife, Fulst immediately went into business with Gutenberg's own top assistant, a guy named Peter Schoeffer, and they started printing books themselves. The inventor of the printing press was left with absolutely nothing.
So Gutenberg, the man, may have lost his workshop, but his idea, well, the genie was out of the bottle. The revolution he started couldn't be contained, and it was about to remake the entire world from the ground up.
The press basically became the engine of the Renaissance. For the very first time, the incredible works of classical thinkers like Plato and Aristotle weren't just gathering dust in some remote monastery library. They were being printed, translated, and spread all over the continent, fueling this massive explosion of art, science, and humanist philosophy.
And then came the Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to a church door. In the Old World, a dissenting voice like his would have been silenced pretty easily, but not this time. With the printing press, his ideas went viral, 16th century style. Over 300,000 copies of his writings were printed in just 3 years. It was simply impossible for the church to stamp it out.
The impact on science was just as earth-shattering. All of a sudden, scientists like Copernicus could share their groundbreaking, world-changing theories with a whole network of colleagues across Europe. For the first time ever, complex scientific diagrams, maps, anatomical drawings, they could all be reproduced with perfect accuracy, creating a standardized visual language for discovery.
But maybe the most profound long-term effect was on literacy itself. I mean, it makes sense, right? With books suddenly becoming cheap and widely available, reading rates just soared. When Gutenberg was alive, maybe 30% of adults in Europe could read. By 1800, that number had more than doubled. Knowledge was finally breaking free from the grip of the elite.
So, while Johannes Gutenberg himself died in relative obscurity, his legacy, well, it's nothing less than the modern world itself. The ripples from his invention are everywhere, even today. The press helped to standardize languages, which in turn helped forge the very idea of national identities. It completely destroyed the old world of scribes, sure, but in its place, it gave birth to the entire modern publishing industry, a whole new economic ecosystem. It was a classic case of creative destruction that laid the very foundations for the world we live in.
In the end, Gutenberg didn't just invent a machine. He invented a whole new way for humanity to think, to share, to argue, to learn. He unleashed the awesome power of mass communication, and in doing so, he created the very first information age. And that leaves us with a pretty powerful question to think about. In our own age of digital revolution, what kind of world are we creating?